history, whenever great injustices existed, youth movements have risen up to combat and end those injustices.
You have organizations out there like the Center for Bioethical Reform,
the Center for Bioethical Reform,
Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform,
organizations like the Center for Bioethical Reform to receive public funds when they then use to attack a woman's right to choose.
Abortion kills all kinds of people, so then all kinds of people can join the pro-life movement to save these babies.
I was talking to a young man on the streets of Toronto.
I spoke with a woman named Lucy about abortion.
Today we were doing Choice Chain in downtown Regina.
By the end of the conversation, she was completely pro-life.
He then walked away 100% pro-life.
Completely pro-life.
We should remember that each of those babies that die every day in Canada not only have the right to life that's being violated, they also have the right to our defense.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pro-Life Guys podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in once again. We absolutely love the support we've been receiving. Just a shout out to my friend Nathaniel. He's been listening to every episode, which is amazing. So thank you for that. He's probably chuckling right now as he hears this. Today we have a pretty unique and exciting episode. We just listened to and watched the debate that Stephanie Gray Connors had with Dr. Peter Singer, professor in philosophy, probably one of the most notable professors. And what we want to do, and when I say we, I haven't even introduced who else is on the program, so do forgive me for that. But we want to talk about this debate and share some of our reflections and responses to some of the things that have been said. But without further ado, I do apologize. Once again, I have on the program with me Cameron Cote. Good to see you, sir.
Good to be back. I thought I was going to get the day off for a moment there when you just launched into it, but I'm back. I'm happy to be here, and I find this super interesting that we're gonna kind of break down this debate between Stephanie Gray Connors and Dr. Peter Singer, because it was almost an identical debate that first got me involved with CCBR. What would have been like 11 years ago? Almost exactly 11 years ago, Stephanie came to my university, University of Victoria, and debated Dr. Eike Kluge, who's a philosophy professor who actually had a very similar argument to Dr. Peter Singer. And Stephanie used almost an identical argument to demonstrate the pro-life position and to get a young whippersnapper like me first involved in the pro-life movement. So it's super interesting to be able to kind of analyze this debate, considering my own kind of introduction to the pro-life movement.
Yeah, that's great. And with us today, we have none other than the Blaise conspiracy, Blaise Alleyne, who is the Eastern Outreach Director in Toronto, works for CCBR. We actually recorded an episode with him prior to this one, but that is going to come out after this one. So if you guys could all wait for that episode, we will have a little bit deeper introductions. But Blaise is on the episode today, not just to, we're not going to have a question and answer session, but we do want to have a conversation in response to the debate that happened. Blaise, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'd say thanks for being back, but I guess it's the first time that the listeners will be hearing it. But I remember Stephanie at the University of Toronto back in 2011 debating the chair of the philosophy department, Professor Donna Lanesley, as well. So this is also not the first debate that I've seen Stephanie had, and it's always a pleasure to hear her debate, and I'm excited to talk about this one.
Yeah, it is a pleasure to hear her debate. And one of the things that I find so exciting about this one is, like, she's debating Dr. Peter Singer, extremely notable in the world of philosophy, and perhaps one of the biggest debate opponents that she has had up to date. And one of the guys, I mean, she's been using his philosophy in presentations around the world for the last decade, showing, this is what he believes, and this is how we can refute that or rebut that. So she's been training people using the words of Peter Singer, but now she had the opportunity to sit down with him virtually and have that conversation. So let's dive in. I think before we start, let's just share what the goal is of this episode. We're not here just to pick apart one side or another. But Cam, could you share with us a little bit why we want to do an episode like this?
I think an episode like this makes a ton of sense, not only because I'm sure many of you may have probably heard about this debate coming up. We certainly shared all about it on the Pro-Life Guys podcast, social media platforms, and I know CCBR was posting on it, lots of other pro-life groups. And so you're probably familiar with it even if you didn't tune into it. But I think it's important to kind of analyze it, not only because there's so many nuggets that we can take out of the debate, not only so many different points and factors that we can draw from Stephanie Gray Connors' excellent delivery. She's one of the most eloquent speakers I've ever heard. I think there's a lot of stuff that we can really benefit from learning from her and her delivery on different points. But I think that there's also a valuable distinction that we should be making as well in understanding the role of the debate versus the personal interaction. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but in some ways, the goal of Stephanie's conversation with Dr. Peter Singer wasn't necessarily to change Dr. Peter Singer's mind on the issue of abortion. I'm sure that she would have been incredibly pleased if she had been able to do that. Obviously, that is a very high second priority. And yet, I think it'd be fair to say that her number one priority was the listeners. The people in the audience who maybe they were actively supporting abortion, maybe actively supporting the pro-life position, but most likely those in what we call the mushy middle. She was trying to engage them with some intellectual points to really draw them towards the pro-life worldview. And I think that it's important in some ways to understand the points that she was making and draw some distinctions between how we can apply similar points to a conversation that you're having, whether at a CCBR choice gene display, whether on a doorstep while you're outdoor knocking, whether just in a conversation you're having with a friend or family member, how you can translate some of her points that into a way that may be a little bit more compelling in a one-on-one interaction where your primary goal is the person that you're looking into the eyes of and not necessarily an audience that you're trying to sway through your delivery and cross-examination and that sort of thing. Two other random asides that I want to make note of right away. I'm sure that we're all thinking them. First of all, huge congratulations to Stephanie Gray Connors. First of all, for her wedding. She got married this summer, I believe, which is super exciting. I have known Stephanie for a really long time. Huge congratulations to her. And the fact that she just drops a bomb in the middle of a debate announcing that she is currently a mother. She is pregnant, and that's super exciting. And so I'm sure that's a massive power flex. I'm sure that she's been dreaming of that moment ever since she started debating, to be able to drop that bomb on her debate opponent, to just add that extra component to the debate. But huge congratulations to her, and also a shout out of appreciation to the Harvard Students for Life group for putting that together. I, as somebody who's helped organize debates in the past, it can be an absolute nightmare trying to get somebody to commit to doing the debate and all the technology. I think they did a wonderful job. And so that's my quick tangent. But yeah, that's why I think it's important for us to analyze it, because I'm sure many people are familiar with it. Many people can learn from Stephanie's delivery. Many people can learn, I think, as well from Peter Singer's position and how we approach, analyze, and respond to it. And then also just how we can translate some of the points that she made into conversational tools for our application in a one-on-one capacity.
Shout out as well to the Massachusetts Citizens for Life. They were also a big part of that debate. It was moderated and hosted by Harvard Right to Life, but Massachusetts Citizens for Life certainly had a big role to play in that as well. As we start this conversation, gentlemen, let's look a little bit at the opening statements that both Stephanie Gray Connors and Dr. Peter Singer made, and some of the foundation upon which their position rests. Stephanie obviously is very pro-life, and Peter Singer, as was a debate, certainly advocated that abortion should not be something that is morally or ethically wrong. But what were some of the foundations, some of the presuppositions that were made by either Stephanie or Peter? Blaise?
Yeah, so for Peter Singer's view, so he's famous for writing a book, Animal Liberation, but people often associate with him with animal rights. He doesn't believe in animal rights. He doesn't believe in human rights. He doesn't believe that rights are a thing when it comes to morality. Rather, his fundamental belief that he put on the table in his opening statement is that, moral status, what matters morally, is whether or not you have the ability to feel pleasure or pain, the ability to experience that sentience, and consciousness, like the ability to have desires. So, and he points out, it doesn't matter what species you are, but he believes that it's those things, the ability to feel pleasure or pain, or to have consciousness and desires, that's what matters morally.
And I think that's an important distinction, Blaise, and I thank you for doing that, because often I've heard a bunch of his quotes that say, oh, well, a newborn infant is less capable than a piglet or a puppy or something like that. Therefore, how can we even consider that they have the same moral standing? It's not that he values puppies or piglets more than humans. I think you hit it on the head that he's valuing a more of a trait, I guess, or like a characteristic, than any species in particular. It's not he's not going to be the one defending all members of endangered species necessarily. He's going to be defending the members of that species that have a particularly valuable, in his eyes, kind of trait, I think. So I think that's a really good distinction there. For Stephanie Gray, I think that she makes her point is arguably based, hopefully, on the same foundation that Peter and I and so many other guests have been talking about since the beginning of this show. The fact that human life begins at fertilization, and that human rights must begin when the human's life begins. I think she made a very, very good and compelling case on the composition and behavior of that one-cell zygote from the moment of fertilization, the point of sperm egg fusion onwards. And I think that she appealed as well to more than just the intellectual, scientific kind of data. I thought that she was just pulling out the concept of personhood as a red carpet to announce her pregnancy and her motherhood. But I think that she did it in some ways to convey the fact that the vast majority of people deep down, whether our conscience or however we want to characterize it, know that parents should look after their kids and not harm their kids. And so I think that she did a good job of kind of something that I talk about a lot in presentations that I give to much smaller audiences and much less prolific speaking events of, we need to engage the whole person, the intellectual, the emotional, the entire person. I think that's kind of what she was attempting to do with that kind of parenthood thing that I almost never bring up in conversation. I hadn't really thought of that before at all. I think the foundation of the pro-life argument and what she was arguing was the humanity of the preborn, and the fact that human rights are not dependent on our age or our ability, but rather dependent on our humanity, our inherent capacity.
Yeah, and on the science, Stephanie laid out the science of when life begins in her introduction. Notably, Peter Singer did not dispute that at all. So for Peter Singer's view, he totally agreed with Stephanie that we're dealing with a biological human being from the point of fertilization. The biology, the science was not in play in debate. That was accepted by both sides.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's often something that's denied when we're talking to people on the streets. But Peter Singer is straight up. He said, yep, they are, Homo sapien. And granted, that's the same thing as a human being. So, there was no discussion on whether we were talking about a human being or not, but what sort of status that human being should have, or what we should be allowed to do to that human. And I found it interesting as well that both of them brought up in various different ways the role of parenthood. As you mentioned, Cam, Stephanie outlined that the role of a parent should be to care for her young human child, her young human offspring, and not to kill them. And one of the things that Peter Singer said a little bit later on in the debate is that, well, what it means to be a loving parent is to bring your child up into, a loving home where they are able to thrive and have a full and wonderful life. And he gave examples well, he didn't really give examples. He just mentioned that he knows people who had an abortion because they weren't able to provide a good standard of life for their child at that particular stage, became pregnant later and loved all their children after that. So a very different understanding of parenthood as well, considering that the human child is actually a human child.
Yeah, and that was kind of the tug of war back and forth that Stephanie was definitely trying to push him on about. I think she did such an incredible job with, especially during the cross-examination. I'm sure that we're going to walk through the different stages as we go, but I think that in one of the really neat things of the way the debate was laid out, and obviously this kind of followed the format of a lot of formal debates, though many of our listeners may not have listened to a ton of formal debates, this idea of an opening kind of statement, and then rebuttals, and then cross-examination, and then final rebuttals or statements, as it were, before Q&A. I think that by laying out the position, Stephanie did a great job of really demonstrating the fact that this view is pretty radical. This view is something that a lot of people are going to have a really difficult time swallowing. And that's what happens when you have consistent debates. And one thing that jumps to my mind, I don't know if it came to you guys, but I think of how we often approached this back before we had the Human Plus X. We're going to talk about Human Plus X, I'm sure, in a little bit, talking about ableism and ageism. But Peter Singer bringing out the idea of this consciousness, ability to feel pain. We often, when we do encounter people on the street, I remember when I first got involved with CCBR, the amount of time we spent talking about SLED, size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, and how once we demonstrated the humanity of the preborn, we would talk to people all the time. Maybe not quite so much anymore, but we would talk to people all the time who would admit, yeah, sure, it's a human, but it's not a human being. It's not a human person, making this distinction between biological member of the species and a meaningful member of our society or community, that sort of thing. And how for a long time we talked about size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, and these things that are different between born humans and preborn humans, but are also different between different born humans, and how there's a sliding scale for all of these different things when it comes to how large we are and whether our human rights should be based on our size, or how developed maybe different degrees of development, whether it's, as Peter Singer had said, the pain, conscious awareness, that kind of thing, our environment, or a degree of dependency. And that just jumped out to me as something that I've heard time and time again. And we used to teach everyone to focus on the SLED before we started talking about the Human Plus X. You get you're not a human with human rights. Just as a human, you have to be able to do something or be something else. And I'd be curious, is that something that kind of jumped out to you guys as well, on the distinction that Peter Singer was making, that SLED? I don't even remember who the first person was that came up with that, but I think of Scott Glusendorf and Greg Kokel touching on that. That certainly sprang to my mind.
Yeah, I think Stephanie did a good job of bringing that Human Plus X argument in to show, as moral philosopher Christopher Kaiser puts it, every other time throughout history that we've done that, to say that, like, to be a human being is not good enough to get your human rights, we've looked back on it as a catastrophic moral mistake, right? So Stephanie was pointing that out with the Human Plus X distinctions. Like she said, I believe she said in the debate, in the past, she would not have been considered a person because she's female, right? And pointing out that whether it's gender or skin color or ethnicity, when we pick these criteria to exclude some human beings from getting their human rights, that's the very definition of a human rights violation. And for me, it was a short anecdote. It was personally interesting because I first came across that Human Plus X argument when I was doing pro-life outreach with Stephanie in Florida back in 2013. That was the first time that I encountered the argument, and it changed the way that I talked about those issues, because it's way more efficient in conversation to make that point about discrimination. That legal personhood is just a way of discriminating against some human beings. So I thought she did a good job of bringing that discrimination to the forefront of the debate.
100%. And I remember back, before we had this Human Plus X, I remember similar Florida trips that I went on, that relying on SLED, I was having 45-minute or an hour-long conversations, often trying to do the common ground analogy question through the SLED argument as well. And the Human Plus X, relying on people's automatic and intuitive rejection of discrimination, really fast tracks the conversation. I think that is something, a nugget that people can definitely pull out and put into their conversations that they're having with their friends and family members, or if you're joining CCBR teams for activism, or your local pro-life group for activism. That's something that you can do to streamline the conversation, to make sure that people are realizing that this mechanism has been used before. And in some ways, I find it powerful to think that we have finally found, tragically, the perfect victim. Right? In each of those other human rights violations that we've had throughout history, the victims have been able to fight back. Right? That this is something that we've discriminated, like you said, on gender and race and skin color and ethnicity and all these kinds of things. The victims of those crimes were always able to fight back, and it was a balance of power. Whereas now with abortion, we found a victim that can fight back in no meaningful way, right? They can do absolutely nothing to defend themselves, and they rely completely on people like us to defend them. And so I find that an even more, I mean, obviously it's difficult to compare human rights violations to each other, but I think that's an important factor in this, that we have found an even more vulnerable population that we're discriminating against now than we have ever found before. And that should raise hairs on our necks even more than these other atrocities that have happened throughout history, that we found this victim that has no ability to defend their life whatsoever.
Just thinking about ageism as well, to dovetail on something that you had said a little bit earlier, Cam. So Stephanie mentioned several times throughout the debate that Peter Singer was being ageist with some of the arguments that he was giving, because he was saying that you need to have, these certain criteria, you need to have developed to a certain point before you can have moral status and have the right not to be killed. But then Peter Singer, in very consistently, I thought, said, well, this is the criteria, the ability to feel or be conscious. And I hold this same criteria for when someone is 50 years old. So if someone is 50 years old and goes into a comatose state, if we can end their life in a way that doesn't cause any pain whatsoever, then he sees no moral quandary with that. So in a sense, that's a little bit different. We're not just talking about ageism, but one of the things that we mentioned last night, we had a long-running WhatsApp chat going with all the staff at CCBR across the country as we responded and tried to hone in on some of the arguments. This really, as you mentioned, is a good case of ableism, having the ability to do a particular function or to just maybe not do something, but think or desire or feel or you name it. Not just the inherent ability as a member of a particular species, but the ability at that particular point. And so someone can, Peter Singer doesn't talk, as you mentioned, Blaise, in terms of rights, human rights or animal rights, but using the rights language, someone can not have the right not to be killed and then have the right to be killed and then have not the right to be killed throughout life. It fluctuates through life depending on where you are at that particular moment. But one of the things I was wondering about, I know Singer touched on this a little bit, about, in a sense, there's kind of three stages to human life. There's certainly, there's the embryonic stage where arguably the fetus doesn't feel pain at all, or that's what we know with the modern technology that we have. And then you have the stage that perhaps you and I are in, all of us at this point, where we most certainly can feel pain, and there's no argument about that. But then there's this stage of like 6 months in utero till, I don't know, like a year after birth, where, okay, they can feel pain, but they're not really sentient. They don't have, they don't know that they exist. They don't desire in the same way that we desire. Could one of you articulate a little bit about what Singer's position was then, in terms of whether it be abortion or what he called active euthanasia?
Yeah, so Peter Singer thinks that pain matters morally, right? That it's morally relevant. We should take it into our moral consideration. But he was clear in the debate last night and in his textbook Practical Ethics under his chapters on taking life. You can see the same thing in more detail. He thinks pain matters, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong to kill. So he said in the debate last night that when it comes to late-term abortions, after a child can feel pain, he's not opposed to them, but he's opposed to them being done without consideration for the child's pain. So he would want, the procedure to be modified in some way, like for an anesthesia to be administered or something like that, right? So he thinks that pain's morally relevant, but you could kill someone painlessly at that time because they're still not a person. And late-term abortion, but also that's where we got into infanticide, where he said he would support active euthanasia in some cases, that is, intentionally ending the life of a child after birth. He was hesitant to draw a hard line as to when a human being becomes a person, which I think is relevant in and of itself. But, he said, somewhere around 6 to 9 months after birth or something. So whether you're talking about the third trimester of pregnancy or the first almost year outside the womb, he still thinks it can be permissible to intentionally kill a human being at that age, at that stage, as long as you do it in a painless way. And I think that one of the points that Stephanie brought up that was great to challenge that view and to challenge the problems with that view. She brought up the case of people like Gabby Gingras, who have it's a rare condition, but congenital insensitivity to pain, right? Where even if they pass that typical threshold where most members of our species can feel pain, they have a particular condition that doesn't allow them, like through the nervous system, they can't feel pain at all, right? And it seems counterintuitive that, killing them would be fine just because they can't feel pain, that pain is ultimately what morally matters. And I guess Peter Singer goes on, with the consciousness and the desires. But I think I'll often say in conversation, I'll say that, I agree that pain could make killing worse, but I don't think pain is what makes killing wrong. You can take the situation like someone with congenital insensitivity to pain, or often for quicker analogies in conversation, I might say, imagine somebody, were to kill you in a painless way, like a bullet to the brainstem or lethal injection in your sleep. Like, would it still be wrong, right? Like pain can't be what makes killing wrong. There has to be something else, some other reason why killing is wrong.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that similarly, when I'm talking to people on street corners and whatnot, I'll bring up this notion, and I think Stephanie did it as well, of talking about people in hospitals who are in kind of an induced temporary comatose, whether you're in for major surgery or have had some kind of accident or whatever it may be. This is somebody who ceases to have the current capacity to have not only the pain, but the rational conscious thought that Peter Singer was talking about. And I think that she pushed him really well on that angle. And then he had an interesting response in kind of the hopes and dreams kind of capacity, that there has to be some kind of, once you have, whether the infrastructure, once you have experienced these hopes and desires and dreams already, then you qualify as a moral character in one way or another. At least that was the way that I was understanding it, because he was kind of saying that if you go to sleep and you're not going to sleep very well if you're worried that people are going to kill you. I think that's the way I understood it.
Yeah. And I wish I could have seen Peter Singer respond to the future like ours argument. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right. I'm going off an elementary school teacher in my experience, but Don Marquis, an atheist pro-life philosopher who's actually debated Peter Singer as well. Peter Singer has said that he thinks that is the most challenging anti-abortion argument. But Don Marquis basically looks around and says, well, if we're going to figure out whether or not abortion is immoral, first let's set aside abortion. Let's try and figure out why killing is wrong. And he takes a whole bunch of situations of, like, a healthy adult human being, an infant, a toddler, somebody in a temporary coma, like a whole bunch of examples, and tries to come up with a consistent reason that we could say that killing is wrong in those situations that most people agree. And the reason he comes up with is that we're denying people a future like ours, or as Christopher Kaiser puts it, a flourishing like ours, kind of packing in some of the Aristotelian stuff for any of the philosophers out there. But the point is, a future like ours. And then Marquis turns to the abortion issue and says, well, does a human fetus also have a future like ours? And yes, they do. And therefore, killing them would be immoral. And I think Peter Singer finds that argument particularly challenging. Like, I think, in practice, I will use that argument sometimes in more philosophical conversations. It's complementary to the core human rights argument, like building on top of it. But I think the reason why Peter Singer finds that challenging is it kind of gets at his hopes and desires for the future, right? Like, Stephanie did a good job at trying to get him to articulate the reason why. She used the word random, and I think Peter Singer was right to kind of correct her. Like, maybe arbitrary would be a better accusation there. Why does it matter? Like, why does it matter that somebody has experienced that desire once in the past before, right? And I think that's the thing that the future like ours argument challenges with Peter Singer is the future of those hopes and desires is still the same, whether or not somebody has yet had the present capacity to have that conscious thought, right? They still have that same future, and that is because they are the same kind of being as us, that we're dealing with other human beings, which I think is another way at kind of getting at the fundamental reason why we would say that human beings have human rights. There's something valuable about human life, but I would have been interested to see how Peter Singer would have responded to that future like ours kind of challenge. It was good that Stephanie, was bringing up the coma and the being put under for surgery and things like that to challenge him. But that future like ours could have challenged that desires thing even further.
Yeah, so let's touch on human rights and who gets human rights. One of the things that, as we've talked about, Peter Singer, valuing pain, the ability to feel pain, and Stephanie Gray Connors mentioned to him that the criteria he was using was completely arbitrary. But then in return, Peter Singer mentioned to Stephanie that her criteria was arbitrary as well. And he was saying that because she was just considering the human species, wasn't considering other species, which he considers valuable as well, and ought to fall into this criteria and be a part of this conversation. Stephanie, when talking about human rights, brought up the UN Declaration of Human Rights. She touched on a little bit from some other organizations. I know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has a phrase, I can't remember what it is, all lives matter, all lives have equal value, or something like that. And so she touched on that. Both documents are documents that Peter Singer would agree with. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, Cam and Blaise, about responding to that challenge with the UN Declaration of Human Rights or another, official document like that.
I got to be honest. I don't know about you, Blaise, but I have such a hard time referencing UN declarations and whatnot. I feel like it doesn't augment my conversations at all because I have such a hard time with the UN as a global entity anyways. I mean, in many ways, it's a political party, and in many ways, I kind of associate that to being similar to the government of Canada. Abortion is legal through 9 months of pregnancy, and we have a child doesn't become a person until it proceeds fully from the body of a woman, sort of thing. That these are legal documents that I'm sure the people who put them together were smart people, but they're politicians first and foremost, I would say. Even if they also have biology degrees and whatnot, they're acting in a political capacity. I have a really hard time relying on these as being meaningful, particularly when you look at how radically pro-abortion the UN and many of their arms and appendages are when they're reaching into third world countries and developing nations, and even in first world nations, that kind of thing, and pressuring countries to increase abortion access and that kind of thing. I find it really difficult to rely and base any kind of sound argument on these different declarations, as well-meaning as they probably were after the Second World War. I just feel like it's really difficult for us as pro-lifers who are trying to stay rooted in something as standardized and objective as science to rely on a political document, legal document, that kind of thing. I don't know what your take is on it, but I just have a hard time bringing it up in conversation within the context that I'm using it. Maybe she brought it up because Harvard has a special appreciation for that kind of administrative baggage, in my humble opinion. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I mean, like I have mixed feelings on the UN in terms of their support for abortion in many ways. I overall don't have a net negative view of the UN, but I still don't use that in conversation typically to make the moral argument for exactly that same reason. It's sort of an appeal to authority. However, I do occasionally use the UN argument just when people are talking about something like there's some kind of international right to abortion. I like bringing up the Declaration on the Rights of the Child and the All Members of the Human Family thing there, which at least sort of muddies the water and makes that like it's a little more complicated. Actually, the UN has said this about the child deserves protection both before and after birth. So I'll use it more as like kind of have that in my back pocket for that, but not to make the central moral argument. But I think what was interesting about the way that Stephanie was using it, what was going on there in terms of, both of them claiming that each other's view was arbitrary, is what surfaced a little bit in the conversation is what kind of moral truths are self-evident, right? And I guess what role our moral intuitions have to play. And I was reading up a little bit more on Peter Singer this morning, and his like the foundations of his moral philosophy. He starts with Stephanie actually pointing this out in the intro too, but Peter Singer believes you need to start out with some axiomatic moral truths. That is, some moral truths that like you couldn't argue for; they're just self-evident. And for Peter Singer, he thinks that's things like, impartiality, like what's morally true for you is morally true for other people and stuff like that. And he's gonna build his moral theory based on that. Where I think that there might have been some benefit in the way that Stephanie used some of those appeals to authority. It's not so much in reaching Peter Singer, because he doesn't believe in rights and he holds the different axiomatic moral truths, but in trying to appeal to the audience and challenge them to see if Peter Singer's philosophy matches up to fundamental moral beliefs that they have, like beliefs in human rights, or in particular, like if you look at the American Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, Peter Singer doesn't. Peter Singer actually doesn't believe that in human equality, or that people have any rights stemming from it. And I think that I'm not a huge fan of the appeal to an authority, because documents can change, their political documents to a certain extent, insofar as they're appealing to widely held moral intuitions that people have. I think that gets to the core of what's arbitrary and what's not when it comes to the foundations of these two different worldviews and these two different moral philosophies.
Yeah, 100%. And that does make sense. Just kind of, relying, like you said, on people's intuition and understanding that. And I, during the WhatsApp chat that went long after the debate ended, I found a really interesting take that I got to be honest, I don't think about very often in conversations that I'm having. And I think that it was either you or Kyle or one of the other colleagues who brought up the distinction. If you need to make a distinction between the human rights argument and an equality argument, that can have a meaningful impact in your conversations if you have somebody like Peter Singer who is challenging the speciesism as just another arbitrary line that might stump some pro-lifers. If you're talking to somebody on the street and they say, okay, well, sure, my view is arbitrary. I'm 100% picking something that I think is particularly valuable, the quintessential attribute of humanity, something like that. But you're being just as arbitrary because you're not consistent either. You're not saying that all lives are valuable. You're just saying that human lives are valuable. He gave vegans and vegetarians a shout out a few times in his presentation. And I think that he makes a good point. But I think that we can counter that very, very quickly with that equality argument that I, whether it's I have never needed it in conversation or whether it's that it never sprang to mind, I found it super interesting to clarify for the person we're talking to that this isn't simply about humans necessarily being better than every other species, but rather equality within the human species. And I was wondering, Blaise, if you might be able to lay that out a little bit more to help if somebody does run into that, oh, well, am I just being arbitrary by saying that humans get human rights sort of thing? How do you kind of tweak it a little bit to help still resonate with that person?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so much more I could say on the speciesism thing. And it was interesting at the end of the live stream, they stopped the recording, but the live stream kept going a little bit as they were kind of thanking each other. And, Peter Singer had said that he would have found it more challenging to respond to a pro-lifer who was also vegan. And I stopped eating meat several years ago, and I'm vegetarian, kind of committed to ethical veganism on the way. And I have a lot, I've been engaging with Peter Singer in a lot of different ways over the last few years. But I agree that there's something more fundamental. We can cut that out to address the core argument by going to human equality. So this equal rights argument is from Josh Brahm and the Equal Rights Institute in the States. And In some ways, they take a different approach to apologetics than we do, and in some ways, they're similar. But I like to kind of keep an eye on what they're doing because I pick up little things here or there that I like to use in conversation. And we usually center our conversations on the human rights argument. Do you believe in human rights? Who gets them? Are we dealing with a human being in the pregnancy? Well, human rights are for all human beings. They start when the human being starts, which from science is fertilization. That's a quick version of it because I know it's been handled on properly in other podcasts. And I prefer that to the equal rights argument. However, when getting to this, like down into the weeds and trying to address in a simple way these more complex philosophical arguments, or this notion, like if someone says, like if somebody's kind of questioning some of the human rights, or just like, well, why should it matter that human beings have human rights or something like that? This is where I find the equal rights argument is useful to bring into conversation. In a way, it almost kind of gets at like a more street apologetics way of kind of making the point that Don Marquis does in his Future Like Ours argument. But the equal rights argument, it's a few simple questions, right? So you start by asking, would you agree that all human adults have an equal right to life? And if you're in conversation with someone, it's usually helpful to make it even more vivid. Like, if I'm on the streets on a campus, I'll say like, hey, let's set aside abortion for a second. Would you agree that like everybody walking around the street here has an equal right to life? Okay. And most people are going to say yes, right? Like that's we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. It's in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. It's everyone has these fundamental freedoms, right? The next question is, well, doesn't that mean that there must be something the same about us, right? Like in other words, if we have an equal right to life, then we all must have something in common that demands we treat each other equally. Like we must have that property equally, right? There's got to be something equal about us to be the basis of equal rights. Third question is, okay, what is it? And then what the Equal Rights Institute does is they'll wait patiently, let people chew on the question for a bit. If they give an answer, they'll engage with it, but kind of give them a shot at answering the question, and then they'll offer their own answer, which is that the one thing that we have in common equally is our humanity, right? That we're all equally human. That's the one thing that doesn't come in degrees. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. Now, Peter Singer will make the speciesist claim, like, well, why are you treating human beings specially? And I'd love to dive into that a little more later, but I like the way, I used to take Stephanie's answer to respond to this, and she gave an even better one last night than the old one that I was using, which is, like if somebody says Black Lives Matter, we don't infer from that non-Black lives don't matter, right? So if we're saying human lives matter, we're not saying that anything necessarily about whether or not other lives matter. We're just saying that at least human lives matter, right? The other way that I've heard her put it before is, the animal rights question, that's an important debate to have. The debate is whether or not we should, like currently we treat human beings better than we treat non-human animals. That debate is, should we treat animals better? Not should we treat humans worse. It's should we give animals rights, not should we take them away from humans, right? So if we're at least talking about human beings, we don't have to make a claim about non-human animals. As Christopher Kaiser puts it, the pro-life position isn't that only human beings are persons, just that every human being is a person, right? So whether we're talking about animals or angels or artificial intelligence or aliens, we don't need to stake a claim in their personhood. We're just saying that all human beings deserve human rights, right? So we can set aside the kind of speciesism question, but the thing about Peter Singer's philosophy is it can't be used to explain human equality, because he bases moral status on things that we have in degrees. As we were saying earlier, as Peter Boss was pointing out earlier in this recording, Peter Singer points to things like, consciousness, desires, pleasure, pain. It's functions that we have. They can come and go, and we get them in different degrees, right? So he can create a intellectually consistent moral philosophy on that basis, but not one that can explain human equality. And he even says, he said in passing in the debate last night, that he felt like, human equality, or the notion we have equal rights, it might be like useful as a kind of political or legal talking point, but he doesn't actually believe in it philosophically. So the thing is, that equal rights argument is really useful when you're when you come up against this philosophy, because somebody might kind of latch on to Peter Singer's philosophy without fully understanding all the implications of it. They might think, oh, he's got like a really smart argument for this, but it's like, okay, but do you believe in human equality? Because you got to pick one. You can't have our moral status be based on something that we all have in degrees, that we all have unequally, without abandoning the notion of equal rights, of human equality. So I don't use it as my like opening in a conversation. It's not where I anchor conversations. I prefer the human rights argument for that. But I do love this equal rights argument as a really simple way to challenge those moral philosophies that are inconsistent with the average person's basic moral intuitions, that there's some concept of equal rights or equal treatment that we deserve.
Yeah, that's great, and really makes it clear as well. I think of the human rights argument, and that really gets to some of the human moral intuitions as well, moral intuitions that so many of us have. Before we conclude this, I have one question that has to do with Peter Singer's challenge on ectopic pregnancy. And I bring this up because the challenge that Peter Singer had is something that I've heard both on the streets and at pro-life conferences like crash courses and different things like that, where during the Q&A, this is one of the questions that's asked. So Peter Singer asked about an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy where the zygote or the embryo implants within the fallopian tube. And Stephanie Gray gave one of the responses that we often give when we're on the streets, compares various types of responses and medical procedures that we can do, some of them which directly and intentionally target that human being, and others that target the fallopian tube. But in every case, the preborn child dies. And then one of the things that Peter Singer said was something along the lines of, well, because you've done the procedure, you are responsible for the outcome of that medical procedure, the outcome being ending the ending of that human child's life. Now, that's something I've heard on the streets. It's something, a challenge I've heard on during these conferences about the ethical nature of any one of these procedures during an ectopic pregnancy. I wonder if one of you could speak to how you would respond to that if you had that opportunity.
Yeah, obviously it comes up very frequently in conversations. I was talking to somebody at one of our choice chain displays maybe a week or so ago. We're getting snow in Calgary here, so we're not doing choice chain quite as frequently because most people still have their winter tires on and people are skating all over the place. But I was talking to somebody and trying to make a very good clarification of what is the goal. Like you said, is it acting directly on the child, or is it acting around the child, and we have a lack of medical resources and technology to be able to sustain the life of the child? And I think Stephanie made a very good analogy of that newborn child running into Antarctica. Sometimes I've actually been making the analogy. I think that it works fairly well, though I'm fairly new in using it, of considering a child who's got a very infectious and incurable disease. And you know what, if that child stays with the family, stays with the parents, then everybody is going to die. Everyone's going to contract the disease. Everyone's going to die. You can isolate that child from the family in a quarantine situation to protect the family. And that child is still going to die tragically. And maybe even quicker. Obviously, the emotional, mental, personal stress that's going to go into that isolation, quarantine in a hospital, unfamiliar environment, all that kind of stuff may actually hasten their death because of the strain on that child. And yet there's a huge difference between that and shooting that child in the head and throwing them in the dumpster so that nobody else in the family gets sick. I'm sure it's not a perfect analogy, but that's the analogy that I have been using to demonstrate the difference in intentionality and the difference in direct action towards that child, I guess.
Yeah, and I think part of the thing with Peter Singer is he doesn't believe that intentionality matters as much. He just thinks all the consequences matter. But I think that for the average person on the street, they don't hold to like this philosophical utilitarianism, which leads to all these other kind of odd conclusions. Like the average person on the street can get that kind of difference, and I like that kind of analogy you use. I haven't had the opportunity to use that on the streets yet, but because it gets at the difference, which is what Stephanie was rightfully illustrating, the difference between killing and being unable to save, right? And what Peter Singer said is he thinks that we should be responsible for all of the foreseen consequences of our actions, and for kind of deeper philosophical reasons, he rejects the double effect reasoning, which would be the more formal way that we would make those distinctions as pro-lifers. But I think that I think that there's something that we can explain to people that makes sense about the difference between intentionally killing versus being unable to save. Like when we're faced with a choice in ectopic pregnancy like that, in any kind of case where we'd use double effect reasoning, our options are to do nothing or to do something that's going to have two effects, a good effect that we want and a bad effect that we don't want. And the question is, how do we make decisions in those cases? And I think that it's intuitive for people to be able to understand that, like, sometimes we're faced with those choices, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that we can't do something that's going to bring about a bad side effect. Like if one of my kids falls, scrapes their knee, and I have to disinfect the cut and it's going to hurt them, like I don't want to cause them pain, but my option is do nothing and that cut could become infected, or do something that's going to cause them pain but also heal the cut, right? So there's these kind of situations that we face all throughout life. And I think, in the ectopic pregnancy situation, we simply do not know how to save the child's life. If we do nothing, the child and the mother are going to die. Yet there is something that we can do, which is simply to remove the child from a situation that would be fatal to both the child and the mother, right? Which saves the mother's life, but we still don't know how to save the child. I think that's very different from being the ones who kill the child. And I think analogies like the one that you brought up, Cam, of a child that needs to be put in quarantine and it might have the unintended side effect of hastening death. But what's the alternative? And are we responsible for that? Are we giving them the disease, or is it just a matter that we don't know how to save them? Right, and I think that's what that distinction comes down to.
Well, gentlemen, that was a very helpful clarification. Thank you for that. We're almost at the hour mark. I know initially in our plan we were going to be doing like 30 to 35 minute episodes, and that never ended up happening. But are there any final comments that either of you would like to share regarding the debate, regarding conversations in the streets, or whatever it might be?
One thing that springs to my mind is just the biggest difference that I see between the debate style and the conversational style are the questions. I think that Stephanie made some very, very compelling points, especially in her preliminary arguments and in her rebuttals and that sort of thing. But I desperately want to encourage you, the listener, as you're going about the conversations that you're having, to ensure that you're asking questions whenever you possibly can. Yes, there are some times when you need to convey packets of information to clarify the pro-life worldview, to clarify the humanity of the preborn, that kind of thing. But if in doubt, ask a question. That isn't the format of debate that works for Stephanie during this kind of context, but don't take away a lot of the information that Stephanie conveyed, but don't take away the delivery and try to implement that in the conversations you're having. Having a 10-minute opening remark with your coworker at the lunch table probably isn't going to make for a meaningful conversation, right? And so rely on the question, still build the common ground, make the analogies, ask the questions, use the human rights argument, apply a lot of the nuggets, but continue to engage with the person, draw from them, try to understand where they're coming from. That's kind of my biggest takeaway for like how you can apply a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, and if I were to add one last thing, I mean, I guess I said some of what I wanted to say about speciesism and the animal rights question and how we can recenter that on human rights. But I think for perspective and conversation, when we encounter people on the streets or in our circles in our communities who bring up the speciesism and the veganism kind of argument, for me, Peter Singer, like as a pro-lifer, grappling with the question of animal rights, Peter Singer was one of the biggest barriers for me because I saw this animal rights view as being as being involved with abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, assisted suicide, involving devaluing human life. And I think one of the things that I realized is that it doesn't need to be that way. So I'm not advocating for veganism here, but for having effective conversations with vegans, I advocate for a common ground rather than a combat approach, right? So recenter it on human rights. But the thing is, I think when pro-lifers who aren't vegans hear the speciesism thing, I think we get our defenses up and we think this person's, attacking human rights. They're hostile to human value. Like I need to take down their whole worldview. And I think the reality is that, Peter Singer questions why we prioritize human beings and don't care about other species, but he trades speciesism for ableism and ageism, right? And you don't have to pick and choose between them, right? We can leave open the animal rights question, and we don't have to try and change someone's worldview on non-human animals to make the case against abortion. We can bring it back to human rights, but also we've got common ground with the average person in terms of concern, like the value for all life, the concern of protecting the vulnerable, maybe even the use of victim photography, right? So my old instinct was I hear animal rights, I think Peter Singer, I'm like, I need to take down your whole worldview. My new move is no, you know what? We actually have a lot of common ground. We can, there's this area of debate we can leave open. We can talk about human rights and why do you value life? Why do you think we should protect the vulnerable? And don't you agree that ageism and ableism are problematic, right? Like that's the direction we can take a conversation.
Yeah. One thing, just to pick your brain on that, I'm sure that we'll do an entire episode on the veganism question. And shout out to my friend of ours, Deirdre, up in Edmonton, who was an incredibly consistent vegan pro-lifer who came down and did an internship with us, though she didn't necessarily come from the same background that a lot of the other interns came from. She was one of those incredible people. When I have conversations with people who are either vegan or even present that argument, sometimes the first thing that I do is clarify, because most people who I've spoken to who will make that argument are not the kinds of vegans like what Peter Singer is talking about. They're you shouldn't be allowed to kill any members of the species at all. Like I'm sure that Peter Singer would make the difference between eating chicken and eating chicken eggs. Caveat there that the eggs, just for those that don't know, the eggs that you buy in the grocery store are not fertilized. And so there is an ethical difference there. Just a clarification, I hear that all the time on the street. And so the first thing that I ask is trying to understand their ethical worldview on veganism. Of the example that I would use, because I grew up in Victoria and we did a lot of talk about West Coast organisms, the California condor, this nearly extinct majestic bird that's in California. Do you think that it's okay to stomp on California condor eggs? Sure, you can't shoot them out of the sky. You can't kill the adults, but do you think that it's wrong to kill not only the newly hatched offspring, but the offspring while still in the egg? Oh yeah, that's obviously wrong. Okay, and so if you protect all members of that species, regardless of their development from the beginning of their life, why wouldn't you do that for the human species as well? Sometimes I try to fast track it that way.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Like I think that approach would be really productive. I mean, okay, if chimpanzees deserve rights, should all chimpanzees deserve rights or only some chimpanzees? Right. And like, okay, well, maybe we disagree about whether chimpanzees should deserve rights or not, or what kind of rights they should get. But if we agree that all chimpanzees should get rights if they're worthy of them, then can't we agree that all human beings should get rights if they're worthy of them? Right. And I think that the point that you're bringing up that that I was trying to articulate, just because we learn something, like just because Peter Singer coined the term speciesism, doesn't mean that every vegan who uses it is a philosopher, right? The average person that we're concerned about is actually concerned about animal rights. Peter Singer doesn't believe in animal rights, right? So I guess don't confuse Peter Singer's philosophy with what the average person on the street believes if they bring up words like speciesism, or if they're speaking from a vegan perspective, because most of them do believe in human equality. They believe in equality for other species as well. We have more in common with the average vegan we'll meet on the streets than we might have with Peter Singer, is the point I'm trying to make.
That's good. Thank you, gentlemen. Well, everyone, that is the end of another episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Blaise, thanks for joining us for this special episode where you are not just a guest, as you are going to be in the one later, although you are a guest, but you're more of a conversation partner, I guess we'll call you.
Glad to be a conversation partner.
Yeah, thanks for allowing us to pick your philosophical mind. Well, everyone, don't forget to share this episode and so many others with your friends and your family and your colleagues, whether pro-life or pro-choice. We know that there are pro-choice people listening to the content that we put out, so thank you for that. Reach out to us. Let us know what you think, whoever you might be. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and on Facebook is where we are. Check out our website as well. Find us on your podcast catcher if you're finding all our episodes on the website. Any last words, Mr. Cameron?
Just the same challenge that I often give. We were encouraged by a good friend of ours in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia to offer more concrete challenges, and so I'll just give that challenge of talk to somebody about abortion. At the very least, consider sharing, like Peter said, either this episode or even sharing Stephanie and Peter Singer's debate. Start the conversation, because we don't save babies if we just think about this behind our own closed doors. We change minds, we save lives by engaging the people around us. It is intimidating. Have one conversation this next week. Go through the common ground analogy question, bring out the human rights argument, and let us know how it goes. Maybe it's a complete flop. Maybe it goes incredibly well and you change somebody's mind. Have the conversation, because the reason, or one of the reasons why Peter, Blaise, and I are able to have these kind of conversations and whatnot is because we've had a ton of conversations. Between us, I'm sure that we've spoken to tens of thousands of people over the last 2 decades about abortion. You build confidence, you build ability through that experience, but you got to start somewhere. So apply these lessons and have a conversation with somebody about abortion.
Yeah, and if you want to get involved in some of the things that we are doing at the CCBR, or through some local groups that we have connection with and work with, check out our website, or CCBR's website, endthekilling.ca. Go to the Take Action tab, and you could find a whole bunch of options there. So get involved, get into some good conversations, and let us know how they went, and let us know what some challenges are that you faced in those conversations, and perhaps we can touch on them in future episodes. Take care, everyone, and we hope you tune in next week.